Hi guys, this is Mark. In this lecture, we will be talking about objects, perhaps one of the most important concepts that exists out there that you will be using over and over when you build applications. In fact, in all the lectures that we have done so far, we had objects in there for that page data element that we kept using throughout pretty much all of the lectures. It is a good example of an object. If you think about it, when a user fills out a form on the screen in your application, whether it's a customer registration form or an order entry form, all the data that you capture from the user, that would be packaged into an object. So if it's the same customer registration form, all the information that you get, such as email address, phone number, address, all of that could be packaged into an object, or perhaps more than one. So the better you understand how to operate on objects and how to apply the concept of objects in the design of your application, the better off you will be. Codeless provides a variety of mechanisms to work on those objects. And you can create objects, you can manipulate objects by adding additional properties, you can extract values from the objects, all of it is there. But most importantly is to understand where those objects fit and how to work with them. And that will take a little bit of experience, a lot of practice, but it's definitely possible. There is really not a lot there to kind of understand about textual structure, a lot more to how to use it. Structurally, an object consists of a collection of keys and corresponding values. So every single pair of key and value, it just goes right into the object. For instance, if an object represents a person, then whatever the properties of that person are, such as name, phone number, email address, age, those are going to be the properties or keys in that object. So for instance, name becomes a key, and then the person's name becomes the value. That's all there is to it. An object may reference other objects. So for instance, take person, and the person has an address. So a property in the object that represents a person could be address, but the value of that property could be another object that in its own terms has its own properties. So for a person, you can grab address, and for that address object, there will be city, street, state, country, whatever you'd like. So it becomes a very versatile structure where an object may reference other objects and so on. When you retrieve data from the database, more than likely you will be getting a collection of objects. You could retrieve a single object, of course, but whenever you, let's say, do a database query, you'll be getting a collection of objects where every single object represents a record from the database. When you want to update a record in the database, you'll be sending an object back to the database. So objects are going to be everywhere. And let's just jump into UI Builder and see what kind of things you can do with objects and how to work with them. And there are not a lot of blocks that give you an ability to work on objects because, frankly, you can just create an object, set a property, retrieve a property, delete. Those are going to be the basic blocks that exist there. But the flexibility that it provides is enormous. So let's just jump right into UI Builder and start playing with objects in Codeless. Now that we are in UI Builder, let's switch to user interface and create a new page using our playground page template so we can start playing with objects. Move the mouse over this editing page area, click new page. In the create as dropdown, select fork. In the source, locate your playground page template and give it a name such as objects page. A new page is created. It is our blank playground with the logging capability. And let's work on the functionality of creating objects. To do this, let's drag a block component, select it, change the direction left to right, and let's drag a few components right into this block. And these components are going to be input, and then another input, and then a button. And I will tell you in a second why it is going to be structured like this. So for the first input, select it, change the label to key, and then select another input and change the label to value. And then the button will be called add to object. Select the block, and let's spread out these child components by clicking this button right here. And if you would like to center them, you can click this button. I think this button right here, they're centered. The reason the inputs are a little bit off of the center line is because there's a bottom margin. So if you want to fix this, click the input, go into dimension, and then zero out this bottom margin. And same thing for the other, just a little tidbit so that it looks a little bit nicer. All right, so this is going to be the general interface for the first exercise. And the exercise is going to be that you will be able to enter key name, you will be able to enter value, and then this key value pairs will be adding to some well-known object that will be sitting in the application. By the way, this will demonstrate how the key value pairs will contain the value, which is just a string. However, keep in mind that the value in objects can be anything. It could be a number, it could be a Boolean value, could be a date, could be another object, could be a list of objects. So it is completely up to you. The rule of thumb is that any objects you create, they need to represent the actual entity as close as possible to what this entity is about. But here, for the demo purposes, it's going to be string for the key and string for the value. By the way, the keys are always strings, so that's just kind of a set in stone. All right, so let's do some data binding. So for the key, let's do the binding of the value to key. And then for the value, the data binding is going to be value. Why do we use data binding? Well, because anytime you enter a value into this input and then a value into this input, it automatically is going to be data bound, so we can retrieve it from page data. Now for add to object, so click this button and let's go to the logic of this button. And then in the onClick event, click the add logic button. And in here, what we are going to do is we're going to take that key value and then take the value for the value. I'm sorry for kind of the overlapping of the terminology, but I hope you understand what I mean. So we're going to take whatever you typed into the key input, and then we're going to take whatever you typed into the value input, and then we will add it to an object. Before we do this, let's review the blocks that we have to manipulate objects. Under System, there is going to be a section called Object. Click that section. So these are all the blocks that you can use to control and manipulate your objects. And most of them are very self-explanatory. The first one is Create Object. So this one will just basically create a new object with some predefined property names, or just a blank object if you'd like. This one sets the property in an object, and we already used it a couple of times. Whenever we need to set something in page data, we use this, for the reason that page data is nothing just but an object that is accessible to all components, to the whole page. It just stays there all the time. Get property, we also used it a number of times. This one retrieves a value that is mapped to the specified key in the specified object. Assign object properties, we haven't used it. Let's skip it for now, but it's also quite important. There are not that many use cases when you need it. It's there for a good reason, because whenever you need it, it becomes very helpful. Delete object property also is quite self-explanatory, where for a given object, we just destroy that key value pair by referencing the key. So anytime here you see property or prop name, it really is the key, because those terms, property name or property and key, they are all used interchangeably. They mean exactly the same thing. Or here, for instance, as you can see, this block says get object keys. So that's a good example where keys and properties are used interchangeably. So this one for a given object will return a list or a collection of all the keys that exist in that object. Convert to text is kind of a useful thing whenever you want to do logging. So for instance, you can take an object, and we will use this one, by the way, and just want to send it to the log for debugging purposes or for sending it to somewhere else that expects it in a string format. What this does is it takes this object and converts it to a JSON format. And if you're not familiar with JSON, you can just Google it, JSON. It's a standard format for kind of representing objects in a string format. And convert to object is the reversal of this one, where it takes JSON and converts that JSON string to an actual object that you can work with using any of these properties. So that's an overview of all the blocks that exist in Codeless to work on objects. Okay, back to our on-click events. So in here, what we are going to do is we're going to take the key and values and put them into an object. And for this, we will use the set property in, and then we will be setting that property in an object that sits inside of page data. Okay, so page data is an object by itself. Inside of this page data, we will have a property, for instance, called my object. So let's just get that value, my object, which sits inside of page data. Don't worry about how this my object got in there yet. We will take care of it. But let's just assume that inside of page data, there is a property called my object that contains that object that we will be just manipulating and adding properties to. Okay, so this guy, this block, returns that dynamic object that we are enhancing and adding new properties to. All right, so in that object that is returned, we will be setting a new property, and the name of that property will be whatever user typed into the key input. Since we use data binding, the data binding for that was key. And the value is going to be whatever the user typed into the value input box, and that will be sitting in page data. All right, that's all it takes. So this will be setting that property in that object. The cool thing about it is that if in our object the property didn't exist, this block right here will create it. Okay, so very simple. Since we use this key value in the labels for our inputs and in data binding, it may become confusing. So I will just one more time we'll clarify what this key and what this value names are. If we go back to the UI and here select this input component, and this input component is called key, and go to the data binding, see the data binding is key property. So what happens is this becomes the property in page data, and whatever user typed in here will be sitting in page data with a key property. Same thing here, but the property will be value. So in our button, we're extracting whatever user typed in, and we're populating our object that is in the my object property inside of page data. Okay, to visualize what we are doing, let's use our logging function to log message. We need to specify page data in here, and then the actual log message, we will use this thing, convert to text. In fact, let's not use convert to text because I want to show you what happens if you just try to log that object. So this will be the object that we are going to be logging. Okay, so this is the object we just modified, and let's send it to the log whenever user clicks this button and we added this property. So let's run it as this and just see what happens. This is not the final version of this page. We'll be adding a couple more interesting things. All right, so for instance, let's say that let's try to compose an object that represents a person. So the property will be name, and the value is going to be Joe. Click add to object. You see it didn't work, and sometimes it's good to show when things don't work. And the reason it didn't work, because we never got any log messages, right? So the reason it didn't work is because in here we're getting a property of page data and there is nothing there. Remember what I said, disregard how it gets in there, and I forgot to kind of bootstrap it. And that's the reason it didn't work, is because we were trying to set a property in something that is not defined. Let's fix this. I guess the good thing about this course is that we show not always how things work well, but we also show when things don't work with an idea of how to fix it. All right, so in here, what I did is I selected the page and I went into the logic of the page, and on page enter, let's add logic to do the bootstrapping part. And then the bootstrapping part will look like this. Select object and do set property in page data. Remember that that property was my object, and the value needs to be just empty object, right? Because we just want to bootstrap it. We want to place this object into page data, so there is going to be something to work with. How do we create a new object? There you go. Here's a block, create object. There is a prop name with an empty connector. We don't need that, so click the gear icon and remove this green thing out of here. So this will just create an empty object. Okay, now things are exactly where they need to be, so it should just work. Once again, we're composing a person. The key is name, the value is Joe. Click add to object. There you go. We got this object, but this is probably not what you expected, right? It's just some default string. Well, it looks like default to me. It may look like something strange to you if you're not familiar with this thing is. Here's what happens. And the reason we see this object, let's go back to our button, is because we are just logging this object as is. And by default, in Codeless, whenever you try to print out, like in log, this object, the default representation is going to be just like that. Those square brackets. Let me show you square brackets object, which is not very useful. I agree with you if that's what you were thinking. So let's fix this. Let's go to object, and in here we have convert to text, which is exactly what we want. So take this guy out, put convert to text, and then the object that we want to convert to text is going to be this one. So we're taking this object that we modified here, sent it to convert to text, return text that goes right into log message. And now things will look much better. Of course, page is reloaded, so our Joe got erased. So let's try it again. Name, Joe. Add to object. There you go. You see this format, and if you don't recognize this format, if you don't know what it means, this is actually JSON. That JSON that I was referring to looks exactly like this. So whenever we have objects, in JSON, they're going to be represented with these curly brackets, and in curly brackets, any key or property name is going to be in the double quotes, then semicolon, actually colon, and then followed by the value. So now let's add age property, and let's say that Joe is going to be 32. Since this input is configured to be text, that 32 will actually be converted to text rather than a number. Of course, if we modified this input to be a number, then it would be a number. But now let's add this to object and see. This is what our JSON looks like now. And see, 32 is in double quotes, which technically is not quite right because this needs to be an integer. But the reason it is in double quotes is because right now this guy sends everything as text. Let's add another property just to finalize it. Phone number. By the way, property names may not have spaces. It needs to be one whole word. So phone number, and let's say the phone number is going to be this 555-1212. Add to object, and we have this string that now contains phone number. So at this point, you can see exactly how that object is composed. By the way, since this object is sitting in page data and is available at my object property on its own, we could actually add some other components to do data binding on these things. In fact, let's do that, and you will see how to use one additional block in the object family of blocks. So going back to user interface, let's grab another block right here, this block, and in this block we will add text component. Here's the text component, and this block will make this dynamic list behavior, because what we want to do is to display in this block all the keys that exist in this my object that we're composing. Click on the logic for the block, and then the dynamic items logic is supposed to return a list of the items that the block will use to start to make a visual collection of. So click on add logic, and in here let's get the actual object first. So this will be my object sitting in page data. So this returns the actual person object, but what we need to do is we need to get a list of the key names. So if you go to object and get object keys, connect this to here and return like this. So what this does is it returns dynamic items, basically the items to be rendered in that block, and these items are going to be the keys of that person object that we're composing. And the person object is sitting in the my object property in page data. Now this will return all the keys, but the key names need to be rendered, which means that this text needs to be bound to render the actual value. Click on the logic for this guy, and in the content logic, click on add logic and return this text to data. Because this text to data is going to be the actual value of the key that is provided by the block. If we rerun the whole thing, it should just work. So let's repeat the whole thing. Name, Joe. There you go. We got name. We have age, 35 or 34. So see, now we have age. We have, for instance, employer. ABC Corp. So see, so this block is working and it's getting the collection of keys right from this object that we are composing. So that's the demonstration of how to use the get keys for an object. Now, of course, it's somewhat useful to know what properties exist in an object, but to make it more useful, how about we also display the actual values? To do this, let's go back to our interface, select the block, change the direction left to right so that we have this text that will display the actual key. Let's add another text that will display the value. Okay, to make them more aligned, select this text and change the dimension to width, how about maybe 150 pixels? That's long enough. Or maybe 200. All right, so this will be the length of the text, and then followed by the actual property value. So select this text that will be displaying the property, go into logic, and the content logic will be like this. So text3 data is still the name of the key. So what we need to do is we need to retrieve the value from my object that corresponds to that key. How will it work? And it goes like this. So we will be getting my object from page data. And from that my object, we need to get the value for the key that is represented by this text3 data. And for this, we'll get the property. And the text3 data goes right into here. Connect. So what happens here is we retrieve the actual object, and then from that object, we retrieve the value of the key that is sitting in text3 data. And the reason text3 data contains the key is because the actual block has the data binding that retrieves the keys. You see how it works? It's kind of a little bit tricky, but once you do it, once you feel it and implement it yourself, it just kind of starts all going into the right places in one's head. Just you sort of get the idea of how all this data binding works. That's all it takes, guys. Let's rerun it. And I'm sorry to bore you with let's change it from person to something else. How about we represent an object that is going to be a country? Okay, so name of that's going to be the property, and then the value is going to be Spain. Add to object. There you go, name Spain. And how about capital? And the value is going to be Madrid. You see, I didn't change the the direction of how those values are replicated, and that messes up the interface. So let's fix that real quick. What we want to do is this. Let's add another block. Change this block to go top to bottom, and this block will be left to right. And in here, select this text, move it into the second block, select this text, move it into here. And we need to swap the places. There you go. So because what's going to happen now is this block, the outer one, will be our container of the dynamic data, and then goes from top to bottom. And then any children that we have inside of this block are going to be replicated for every single new item. And that's the thing that I didn't account for. But now it should just work. All right, let's see. I want to make it a little bit minimum height. Let's get rid of the minimum height. And then in here, this block just stays the way it is. All right, let's rerun it. Once again, country name, Spain. There you go. Capital, Madrid. There you go. Language, Spanish. So now we have visualization of our object that is dynamically populated. So this amounts for the majority of the use cases that exist out there. Of course, since the object structure is so versatile and provides for so many different combinations where a property can contain a collection, or an object may contain other object that in turn has properties that contains a collection, all of those things are possible, but recursively it will work exactly the same way as we have seen now. Just need to remember that you can set a property, you can retrieve a property, and when you get it, you work with that property just like with everything else. So when you retrieve a property value, and if that value is a collection, work with it as a collection. I hope you found this useful, guys. Please try to do the same thing that we did here, just so you can see exactly how it works. Ask any questions. I would like to help out with anything that is not clear, because this is going to be one of the most important concepts that exists in Backendless, that exists in our Codeless and UI Builder implementation. Thank you for watching this video, and as always, happy Codeless coding.